Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of The Pulse with BP. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam, folks. I'm so excited today to be joined by Damon Amendolara, DA, with CBS Sports Radio from 6 to 10 a.m. Eastern. He also works with Nomad on YouTube, and he's got a bunch of other ventures. Damon, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Billy. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Well, that's where I wanted to go with you first. How have you been doing during this pandemic? I mean, this has affected our lives both professionally and personally. So how has it impacted you in those aspects?
Well, personally, I appreciate you asking. We're doing fine. Family's been fine, and that's been good news. Professionally, it's been a bit of a change. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but we've been doing our shows, and all of our people involved have been in different places. So I've been hosting it from my home office. We've had my producer at his home office, our update anchor at his home office, and then our board op back at the studio. And so we're all in different regions, different zones. So that created a little bit of a disconnect early. Hard to have the same chemistry. We're not in front of one another like we usually are in the studio, but we figured it out. We use technology. We're on a Zoom call with each other every single day so we can at least see one another. We also have a G chat going on, a Google chat, so that we can chat with each other without being on camera. So things behind the scenes, little additions here, edits there. And we've really stayed in contact via texting pretty regularly, I think more so than if we saw each other at the studio every single day. So we figured it out. It took a couple of weeks to figure it out, maybe even a couple of months, but we figured it out. And I think that the show is now kind of clicking on all cylinders again. You can't ever replicate, being together with one another and seeing one another in person, but I think we're pretty close. So I take a lot of pride in that.
Well, that's good to hear. Let's go back to more happier times, DA. You're a Warwick, New York native. When did you know you wanted to go into sports radio?
Well, that's an interesting question. When I was in high school, I knew I wanted to be in sports media. I really loved sports. I liked talking about sports, and I felt like it was something that was really an ambition of mine and a goal of mine. So I went to college to try to achieve that goal. I went to a school that had a good broadcasting program. I graduated with a broadcast journalism degree. But when I was at Syracuse, I did everything. I did student television. I worked for the student newspaper. I worked for the student radio station. I interned at a TV station. I even worked in the PR department, sports information department. And I tried to do everything to just see where I fit. And when I came out of school, I had a radio tape, a sports radio tape to do play-by-play or to do some anchoring. But I didn't really have a sports talk tape. I didn't know if I wanted to do sports talk. But one thing led to another, and there was a job that opened up after a number of months of searching for a job and not being able to find one. A job opened up that it was producing behind the scenes, but also doing some hosting as well. And I felt like, well, at least it's behind a microphone. And then once I started doing it, I really loved it. And so sports talk kind of found me. I sought out a job and I sought out radio because I love the medium of the entertainment of the mind, the theater of the mind, but I didn't know it was going to be sports talk. And when I fell into it, it ended up really working out for me.
Well, you mentioned Syracuse. I mean, you're a Newhouse graduate. You worked with WAER Radio. How important was your time there to springboarding your career? And I guess I'm curious, DA, had you not gone to Syracuse, do you think you would have still been able to get to the position you are today, given, of course, Syracuse's great credibility, longstanding traditions in helping sportscasters make this medium?
Yeah, I think about that. I think had I gone to a different school, and I looked at a number of schools in the Northeast, I think I still would have found my way into the industry because I just had a real burning desire to do it. And I'm kind of a stubborn guy by nature. And so had I been told no a number of times, I still think I would have figured out a way to do it because I was told no coming out of Syracuse. And I just kept plugging along. But I think what was different was at SU, it was so competitive. There were such talented guys around me that I had to be the very best of myself. And I couldn't get lazy. I had to try to achieve what I thought was the gold standard in guys that had come before me. And so when you're listening to guys that were students before you, like Mike Tirico or Ian Eagle, Sean McDonough, Dave Pash, all those guys were 5, 10, 15 years before me. It was like, oh, I've got to be that good. And then my classmates, Andrew Catalon, who calls NFL games, Carter Blackburn, who calls college football games, they were my classmates. And so I had to be as good as them, or at least close. So when you have that type of competition, it forced me to be better than I could have ever been anywhere else, because I could have gone somewhere else and maybe been good, but not pushed myself to the next degree, the next degree, the next degree, to try to really perfect and hone the craft. And that did me a great service coming out of school. And because I was ready for competition, I was ready to be told no, I was ready to be told I wasn't good enough, because I had been, against those guys for all 4 of my years in college. So that's where it really helped me.
And speaking of, after you graduate from Syracuse, I mean, I was looking it up. You go all over the place: Naples, Florida, Rochester, New York, Kansas City, Miami. Oftentimes in these places, you were not only doing local radio, you were also doing play-by-play stints as well. What do you remember about those experiences?
Well, every single one of them had a really important impact on my life. That first job in Fort Myers, Naples, was that gig I talked about. They needed somebody to do everything. They needed a producer, they needed a board op, they needed an update anchor, a fill-in talk show host, a pre and post game host for an arena football team. They needed it all. And it allowed me to learn every bit of what radio is all about. And so I was thrust into it at 22 years old. And it was like, hey, figure it out. You got to figure it out right now, because you control a lot of what's at this radio station, because we had a really small radio station and I was one of the only full-time employees. And a lot of that busy work fell to me. Figure it out. So I learned quickly there. And that was an incredible education. And then I moved to Kansas City. And what I learned was expectations of a market where, it's a major story if you do something. So I eventually became the morning show host in Kansas City, and ratings were published in the newspaper every month or every 2 months. And it was like, that's your name and that's your ratings number. And you better be ready for that public exposure to being vulnerable and having to deliver. You are responsible for delivering. And then I went to Miami, and there was a lot of lessons there. It was a market that was not a traditional, intense sports market. So I had to be more creative. I had to be more entertaining. It couldn't just be about whether the Dolphins needed to draft a linebacker. I had to fill 3 or 4 hours a night and be outside of the box. And that allowed me to really explore the show. And then in Boston, it was an intensity of scrutiny. Everything I said was impactful, mattered, controversial, debated, argued, what have you, because they're so locked into sports, and sports media becomes almost the 5th team to cover. So there are feuds and there's articles in the newspaper, and you're covered as a member of the media. So that scrutiny was something to learn. So every step that I had taught me something else, and they were all hugely, hugely important into my development as a sports talk host.
You mentioned Boston. I was curious on your opinion. Do you think it's the best sports town in America? I mean, you think about the passionate fan base they have, the success of the teams, Celtics, Bruins, Red Sox. I mean, do you think it's, if not number one, at least up there in terms of best sports town in America, with you having worked there?
No doubt about it. And it's definitely, I believe, the most intense. I think the intensity comes from the pressure on the teams to win. Now, having won for 20 years, I mean, a city that now you have to win or else you're a disgrace. I mean, Red Sox fans are fleeing, and Celtics fans aren't happy with only losing the Eastern Conference Final. And I mean, look, a 7-9 Patriots season, forget it. That's completely unacceptable. So the pressure is so intense, and it's also an in-your-face sports town. If they don't like you, they will tell you. And I was told many times from people that didn't like the show. And so, yeah, it's just so intense. It's such a combative atmosphere. Media fights with the media. I mean, it's a whole thing. But that scrutiny and that passion, that intensity makes it great. It makes it so great because everything matters. I mean, you could only imagine coming from Miami and going to Boston. In Miami, unless you're really in the playoffs or something, you kind of don't matter. It's like, wake me up if you're going to be in the playoffs. But in Boston, man, week 1, opening day, whatever it is, first shift of the Bruin season, that matters. So yeah, it's no question one of the best sports towns in America.
How did this opportunity open up at CBS Sports?
Well, when I landed the job in Boston, that was a CBS Sports Radio. That was a CBS radio affiliate. That was within the CBS company. And so I'd worked there for 3.5 years or so in Boston. But before that, I had done part-time work at WFA in New York because that's where I was originally from. So on my vacations, if I had a week off for Christmas or a week off in the summer in Kansas City or in Miami, I would fly home and I would do fill-in shows on the Fan. I wanted to get my name out there. I wanted to get my name out there for CBS. I wanted to get the reps. I wanted to do it in my hometown. And so that put me on the map at CBS. And then CBS offered me that Boston job. And I did that for 3.5 years. And the success I think that we had as a sports radio station in Boston gave me some credibility in the boss's eyes. And then when they launched CBS Sports Radio as a network, they had said, would you like to be part of it? I didn't even know what shift it was going to be. I just said, yes, whatever it is, I'll take it. I want to be back in New York and I want to be working at a national level. That was a real dream of mine. And so when they offered me the overnight show, I was like, I'm in, let's do it. So the opportunity opened because I tried to do a little bit more everywhere that I was, try to open up doors, try to make phone calls, try to be in front of a microphone so that they could hear what I sounded like. And ultimately it ended up paying dividends.
So, I mean, you host a radio show 6 to 10 daily. I mean, how do you prepare for a show? I guess people just don't realize you don't just roll out of bed and start doing your radio show. I mean, what is your day-to-day preparation like to get prepared for your show to be on the air for 4 hours?
Well, it's interesting. I think unlike a lot of jobs, I'm constantly looking at what I might talk about. So I'm on Twitter throughout the day to just see what other people are talking about, to see what the stories are. I would say 5 times a day, every 2 hours or so, I just click on ESPN, the app, or CBS Sports' app, just to see what the headlines are. Because, if I'm taking a nap, if I'm grocery shopping, if I'm with my wife or something, and I missed that, somebody got traded or somebody got fired or somebody got hired or something, I've got to know that. So you're never totally disconnected. I mean, the first thing I do when I wake up from a nap or from sleeping is you pop on the phone and go to one of the apps to see what happened while I was sleeping. So I think that's unlike a lot of other jobs in America where you punch in your 8 hours and then you don't really have to worry about what's happening. And then at night, my producer sends an email and it has probably the top 10 to 15 stories of the day and talk topics. And then I cull that and I look at my top 7 or 8 stories that I really feel strongly about. And I say, okay, let's talk about those. And I map out segment by segment what we're going to talk about in each segment, along with the interviews that we have lined up. And then I use some time at night, a couple of hours at night before I go to bed, to research the interviews that we'll have, to study up on the subjects that we'll have, to read some articles, and to jot down some notes that I might have about the upcoming show. And then the next morning we do the show. And then at 10 a.m., it's okay, let's decompress for a little bit, but then let's start thinking about the next show because something's going to happen in sports over the course of this day that you have to be connected to. So it's kind of a never ending cycle, but the hot times of it are definitely at night when you're preparing for the next morning show, which is different in this time slot because I used to do nights and it was preparing during the day for the show. In this case, we're preparing at night for the next morning.
That's quite a day for sure. What's the best interview or maybe the most memorable interview that you've done that you can remember?
Well, sometimes the best interviews come out of non-sports related things. We had Art Garfunkel on the show a couple of years ago, and Art was promoting an album, a re-release, I don't know, maybe a book, maybe a memoir. And I had asked him about breaking up with Paul Simon many, many years ago. And he was so offended that I would ask him that. He was so offended. And I said, this is not something I'm making up. This was quotes from Paul Simon that said you were difficult to work with. And he went off on me and he hung up on me. And I was like, wow, I made Art Garfunkel mad. Now you come into a sports radio show every morning and you think you're going to be talking about sports topics, LeBron or Tom Brady or what have you. You never expect that you're going to make a rock and roll legend mad, but I did. And so I would say that is one of the most memorable interviews I've ever had, definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely something you can share down the road for sure. And also you do a travel series called Nomad, which I found interesting. You shoot, edit, and produce the entire thing. How did this idea for this show come up?
Well, I travel a lot for my job. And so I'm always at games. And I really love going to games as well. So even if it's not for the job, I will try to travel to a college football game every year that I've never been to a stadium, or go to an NBA arena, or, just be out at events. And I said, when I travel, I really love to explore local culture, food and drink, and, places to hang out and the sites. And I said, it feels like this would make for a good digital series. And now YouTube is kind of the perfect place, or social is the perfect place, because you don't need to have a full half-hour episode or something like it was traditional TV. You can just do it however long you want to do it and edit it the way that you want to do it. And I've always really loved video, shooting, editing, stuff like that. So I just decided, what, let me document all these travels that I have. And it became a really fun, really cool thing. And I really enjoyed it. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work that, is not for a paycheck. It's just for my own entertainment. But to look back and see that there's 80 episodes of a travel series that I produced feels pretty good. So I like the fact that it's out there and counting. We'll still have more episodes coming out.
For sure. Is there a favorite arena or stadium, or maybe the city you've traveled to? I mean, you mentioned you travel a lot. Is there something that sticks out? You're like, man, that was quite a city to travel to, whether it was the actual stadium or just to explore the city?
From a college football standpoint, I'll never forget Baton Rouge and LSU. That's a common one for a lot of people. But me and a buddy of mine showed up, a couple of native New Yorkers, and we didn't have a car. We got dropped off by a cab. We didn't have a tailgate to go to because we didn't know anybody. So we just brought in a case of beer. And as we were walking into the parking lot, somebody just stopped and started talking to us. And he said, "You guys are all from New York?" We said, "Yeah." "You're here just for an LSU game?" "Yeah." "Well, then you got to meet my friend. You got to go over to his tailgate. You got to hang out with him." And sure enough, we just blindly go over to this guy's tailgate, and he invited us in, and it was one of the best days ever. And we just had a good time eating gumbo and jambalaya and drinking beers and whatever, and going into the stadium. And it was such an unbelievable atmosphere because the stadium as well is so loud and so on top of you, that the whole day lived up to this great expectation of this is what LSU football is about. And we were fish out of water, but we were embraced totally. So that was so cool. And I love the old ballparks in baseball. I love Fenway. I love Wrigley. Wrigley is one of my favorite experiences ever in sports. And I wish more ballparks had that type of history, but every time I'm at Fenway or Wrigley, I just feel like this is so, might not be comfortable. The sightlines might not be great, but it feels like old school baseball. And I love that.
That's awesome. I want to ask you, DA, about a relationship you had with a particular fan of yours, and that's Mo Gabba. I mean, he was had to deal with blindness. He was a Baltimore sports fan. Had to deal with several different cancers in his life. Unfortunately, passed away last July. He called into your show. I know you had a great relationship with him. Even, I believe, one of your episodes with Nomad had you traveling to Baltimore. I mean, how do you describe your relationship with him?
Well, he was pretty magical. He was a young kid at 8 years old that started calling our sports radio show because we were on in Baltimore where he grew up. And we didn't know that he was blind. We didn't know that he was sick. He just had such joy in his laughter and his calls and his voice that we were all just drawn to Little Mo, because Little Mo in Baltimore was always so fun to have on the air. And then I got a few stories passed along to me about this young man that was hosting a panel discussion at Orioles Fan Fest. And he was throwing out the first pitch at an Orioles game. And he was calling a play at Ravens training camp. And I said, "Is that my Little Mo?" Sure enough, the more that I read about him, the more that I realized it was the same guy. He was calling local Baltimore sports radio. And so I just said, wow, Little Mo, I had no idea about this background of him. I had no idea that he was dealing with this type of health issue. And I had no idea that he affected so many people, but I could see why he did, because his joy was so obvious. So to watch him with such a lifetime of pain with cancer and blindness, what have you, be such joy and be such happiness, really, impacted me very deeply. And so when Mo passed away back in July, it hit me very hard, but I carry with him, his lessons every single day. And that is, no matter what your day looks like, you have a choice whether or not you can be happy or not. He chose every single day to be happy, even though he had the worst hand ever dealt to him. So what? I got a bad day because an interview fell through, or our equipment broke down, or the mortgage didn't get paid on time, or I got bills stacking up, or whatever. No, I don't have an excuse. There's no excuse. Doesn't matter how bad your day is supposed to be. If Mo could find a way to be happy, I can find a way to be happy. So I carry that with me every single day, and he is he's one of my heroes.
That's so awesome to hear. And in that same vein, I mean, DA, you're very involved with philanthropic projects. I saw you started a Team DA charity. You've done a host of other projects as well. What made you think about, starting those ideas?
Well, in Kansas City, in the Midwest, it is almost expected that you partake in charity and community endeavors. It's just a part of the country that really believes strongly in that, and I really resonated with that. I believed if I was asking our listeners to be loyal to me and my show, the least I could do is to be loyal to them and their community. And so I just felt like it was paying it back. So we did a lot of charity work in Kansas City through the show. We did the same thing in Miami, did the same thing in Boston. I still do work in Boston. And I just believe that we have a platform we've been granted that we should use it to do great things instead of just worrying about ratings and our next show. So I try to keep that as perspective and balance. And anybody that's done charity work knows that you get so much more out of it than you put out. Whatever you think you're doing to help somebody, you get it back 2, 3, 10-fold. So I'm always happy to partake.
That's certainly awesome, and probably more important than anything you'll ever do behind the mic with your job. I wanted to ask you, what's your advice, DA, to young broadcasters like myself who are trying to make it during this pandemic? I mean, you know better than anyone, it's already a competitive field in normal times, and now we have to deal with the realities of this pandemic. So what's your advice to guys and girls like myself who are trying to make it in this business?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to remember. Number one, to be ambitious about everything. I think if you ever feel like you're going to wait for the job to come to you, or you ever feel as though there might be a job that's beneath you, you got to get that out of your mind, because embracing everything and seeing where you fit is what worked for me. Had I said I was stubborn, I was not going to do sports talk radio, I don't end up here. And I didn't really love sports talk radio coming out of college, but I allowed the job to find me and be open-minded. I think also saying yes to a lot of experiences, being flexible. Don't say no because you don't have the time. Don't say no because you worry about being overwhelmed. Don't say no because it's not enough money. Say yes and just see how it goes. And then the other thing is, you are afforded in 2021 to be your own director, program director, producer. When I'm coming up through high school and college, the internet is in its infancy. There is no YouTube. There is no social media. There is no digital editing on your laptop. There is no home microphone or Zoom setup. There's no Twitter. There's no anything. So you are limited in the 90s and 2000s in your reach and your production, and you're just limited. Today, there is no limitations. You can be your own everything. So instead of looking at COVID as some type of limitation, look at 2021 as a chance to be empowered, because you hold everything in your hand. I could only imagine what I would have come up with in 1996 or 1997 in high school if I had all of this at my disposal. It is empowering. So use it. Use all the tools afforded to you, because you have more than anybody ever has.
Certainly a great piece of advice right there. I was wondering, DA, because you did play-by-play, have you ever thought about, man, I wonder what would have happened had I pursued play-by-play full-time, or is that something you don't really try to look back on?
I didn't love it. I liked it. I liked doing it in college, at SU. Like, the pinnacle of student radio at SU is calling Syracuse basketball games. And I liked doing it, but I could tell my classmates loved doing it more. I liked it. I wanted to be good at it. I took it seriously, but I didn't need it. And when I did play-by-play after that, again, I liked it. I worked at it. I didn't need it. What I needed to do was be creative behind a microphone, whether that was television, radio. I needed to be creative, and play-by-play doesn't necessarily afford you that. And so I kind of knew if I wanted to do it, I could, because I took it really seriously and I had a good background in doing it. But if I really wanted to be driven by what was deep within my heart, play-by-play was not what was in there. It was more about being creative behind a microphone and showing my full personality with a show, something like I do now.
For sure. And I wanted to ask you about a mutual friend that we have, and that's Bill Roth, another one of your Syracuse family alum. He's been a professor of mine at Virginia Tech. I mean, how do you describe your relationship with Bill?
Well, Bill is both a mentor and a friend. And, at first it was mentor because he was one of those guys I really looked up to coming out of SU. And he was immediately accessible, which is so hard and unique to find with guys that are that successful. And he's a legendary broadcaster. And the moment you emailed him or called him, he would get back to you and he would have honest critique of your stuff and he wanted to help. And at times I felt kind of sheepish even asking for help because I knew that he would go to the end of the earth to help me. And I didn't want to over ask or overstep. So those are just really unique people in life. And then as I got older and more established, I felt like we were more friends. And Bill is remarkably talented, incredibly hardworking, totally dedicated, but is also a great person. And that's the people I admire. Somebody that can be this great at their job, but balance it out with everybody having good things to say about you. So Bill is one of the best ever. And I feel really fortunate that I found him through the SU connection and to be a friend of his, because there's just not a lot of people like Bill Roth. You know that from being around him. There's just not a lot of people like him. And that's saying something.
Yeah, certainly a terrific person. And DA, you've been so gracious with your time. So I have one final question for you. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? I mean, you're doing a national radio show, 4 hours every day. I mean, I'm sure this is a goal of yours you've had all of your life. Is there something else you want to do in 10 years? I mean, where do you see yourself in 2030? What are you hoping to do?
Well, I hope I keep doing this because this show's really fun and it makes me happy every day and it makes me laugh every day and it makes me think every day. And how often can you say that about your job? So I love this job. I hope that there's more television opportunities because I'd like to do both, either the show being simulcast on TV. Right now it's on digital. So we do get a simulcast. I'd like to have it on a traditional television network. So that brings in some more audience and eyeballs and resources. And then I'd also like something like Nomad or a side, another part of my job to be on the television side, because then there's a visual component. And I love the visual presentation as well. So something that has to do with travel like Nomad or my sports background, but with a visual component would be really cool as well. So I hope that also is part of it. But I've realized that if you went back 10 years, so this would be 2011, I don't know if I could have foreseen what happened in these 10 years. So I can only imagine that the same thing is for the next 10 years. And I'm excited to see what happens.
Well, DA, this has been such a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking to you.
My pleasure, Billy. This was a lot of fun, man. Thank you.
For sure. Well, that's Damon Amendolara of CBS Sports Radio, Nomad, and a bunch of other ventures. He's been so kind to join us on the latest edition of The Pulse with BP. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam. Thanks again, folks, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.